Across Britain, bakers work to feed our passion for bread and cake. But where did this £4 billion a year industry come from? To find out, 4 professionals are going back in time. They're baking through 63 years which transformed their trade and our diet forever. The age of the Victorians.
From the rural bakeries of the 1840s, where baking had barely changed for centuries,
to the sweat and toil of the urban bakery at the height of the Industrial Revolution,
to luxurious high street retailers at the dawn of the 20th century.
This is chuffing heavy.
They'll experience firsthand the tough conditions faced by the workers who fed the nation.
The physical exertion just to get the damn stuff made is pretty much sickening.
To be a woman in this age, you'd almost feel a bit like a caged bird.
Bakers back then were the people who stood between Britain and starvation.
It's really upsetting. It was about staying alive for these people.
It was an era when bread was mostly natural and wholesome.
Oh, gosh, that's lovely.
But was sometimes poisoned.
This is potassium aluminium sulfate.
Doesn't that cause brain damage?
Until it took the form we know today.
This doesn't complain, this won't die, and this can work 24 hours a day.
Welcome to the future.
They'll bake things virtually no one has tried for at least a century.
Oh, wow. That is phenomenal.
It's got this grittiness about it, which is just awful.
That looks hideous.
That was horrible.
This, for me, is actually tasting history.
They'll work in ways very different from today.
We're cheating. That's the issue, it's cheating. And I feel ashamed.
These guys would have lost their minds.
They're recreating the bread that made Britain great.
That is the business.
And the lives of the people who baked it.
I clearly need to learn a thing or two from the Victorians.
When Victoria became Queen in 1837, the majority of Britain's population still lived in the countryside, so that's where we're starting too.
You and I both know that the challenge with this project was always going to be to find an authentic bakehouse.
Yeah, back in the day, in the Victorian period, every single parish would have had either a communal oven or a village bakehouse, and so few of them still exist, and even fewer of them still work.
But I think we have found the perfect candidate in the heart of a rural community.
We've come to Sacrowell in the Cambridgeshire countryside, where a bakery was built in the early 19th century next to a mill house.
In Victorian times, bakeries had an average staff of 3 or 4 people. So to staff our bakehouse, we've recruited 4 passionate bakers from across the modern industry. Whether factory owner or artisan, all will bring crucial skills because each of their different branches of baking has its roots in Victorian Britain. John Swift, for instance, runs a family business that began life over 150 years ago in the Victorian countryside.
It started with my great-great-aunt Harriet. Her husband was in the field and she baked for the village, and there's been a Swift baking ever since.
Now he's leaving behind his Shropshire High Street to experience the kind of rural business his great-great-aunt would have known.
It's going back to where we began and to see what my ancestors did and how they coped with it. I want to find out exactly how tough it was.
At the start of Victoria's reign, a baker's life seemed gentle, simple and steeped in tradition. There was only really one type of baker, the person who made the daily bread, on which every community depended. Soon, they'll face dramatic changes. But first, they're experiencing the last days of a rural golden age, the 1830s. And like them, their bakehouse has been kitted out for the period.
Wow.
Wow.
Dough will be mixed by hand.
Little dough trot.
That's just standard coffin.
Yeah.
Well, breaking new ground for me because I've never used one of them.
Let's have a look at this beast over here.
That oven is an incredibly rare survival, and back in Victoria's reign, it would have been churning out bread on a daily basis.
Wowzers.
But it's essentially based on a medieval style of oven.
There's a real sense of continuity here, I think. I mean, bakers have been baking like this for hundreds and hundreds of years, and although it's all about to change, right here, we really are looking backwards.
Used to something that small?
No.
This is a slightly worrying thing for me because it doesn't plug in.
And it doesn't beep, and it doesn't have a digital display.
We've all become reliant on, like, kit machines of some description. Yeah. But what do you need to make bread? You need some flour.
You need these.
You need some hands, and you need a bit of kind of knowledge.
Compared to what they used to, this isn't a huge space, and the equipment is quite primitive.
Yeah, but I suppose it doesn't need to be any more than this. I mean, a bakery this size would be feeding, what, 50, maybe 100 people at most?
I think it certainly looks the part, especially when we look at some of the images from the period.
Right, you've had a chance to explore your bakehouse. The first thing we're going to do is bake a standard loaf of bread, the kind of thing that would have been made for agricultural workers when Queen Victoria was young.
Now, baking Victorian bread from scratch takes around about 9 hours. So you've got all of your ingredients to prepare, you've got a number of processes to go through, you've got to get your fuel for the oven, and of course you've got to get your oven up to heat as well.
Yeah.
The main thing is, you're professionals. You know what you're doing. As historians, we can learn a certain amount from books, but what we're hoping is that you can use your modern expertise to take us that bit further, so we can really gain an insight into what it was like to work in a Victorian bakery.
It's over to you.
Sounds good, thank you.
Yeah.
OK. Should we share this one?
We'll share
This one.
We've left the bakers with some rare accounts of professional baking from this period.
Be great to find a recipe.
Now, compared to what they're used to, that's quite a small oven.
Well, I think they're going to look at the oven and think, 4 of us, easy. But what they haven't really realised yet, I think, is that baking bread is only a very small part of what they've got to do.
Somebody needs to do the weighing up, don't they, and find the ingredients and
And someone needs to like that beast.
Right.
So we split into two
groups.
teams.
Yeah.
Small rural bakeries like this were often owned and run by families, sometimes for many generations. So they're unlikely to have had a strict hierarchy of roles. Instead, bakers would share out whatever task needed doing.
I don't quite know on this oven where the fire goes.
John Foster is the most technically minded of the bakers. Together with Harpreet Bora, he's tackling the first task of the day in any bakehouse.
Yeah, we've got soot there, so fire has to be lit inside that chamber. Compared to my ovens at the bakery, a little bit different in size.
In the 21st century, John runs an industrial bakery in Barnsley, which turns out 1 million products a week.
The Victorians are most admirable for the way they industrialised things, making all these machines. These guys built things to last, and they built things of great quality, of great ingenuity.
But at the start of the Victorian era, baking hadn't been mechanised. Ovens relied on the same fuel the ancient Romans would have used. Dried bundles of sticks, called faggots, were still the optimum fuel.
So I presume that we're actually putting this into the
Yeah,
top
I know
of the
it may
oven.
come as a surprise to you with your modern ovens, but yeah, you're actually going to have the fire in the oven.
That doesn't really leave us much space for anything.
No. We're going to get really rapid heat, really high heat. Those bricks are going to absorb all of that heat. Then we're going to rake it all out, and then it's ready to take our bread, but only if it's hot enough.
Thank you.
OK, thank you.
OK.
Right.
Should we try fanning it a bit?
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
This seems so much more laborious. I walk into my kitchen and literally turn the oven on, and in 10 minutes' time it is good and ready to go.
But we have to draw a picture of a switch on the oven. We can
But
turn
doesn't
it.
this seem strangely more satisfying?
It
than
does
that?
actually, yeah, yeah.
It's the
All the
sense of
fun's gone out of
satisfaction.
baking these days,
I
hasn't
know.
it?
Oh, wow.
God, that's fantastic. There it is.
That is
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, a bit different from a microprocessor-controlled electric thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
In some ways, it's more reliable. There's nothing to go wrong here, is there? You just do it.
Yeah.
One of the crucial ingredients for bread took up a lot more of a Victorian baker's time and money than it does today. Back then, yeast didn't come dried in packets. Bakers bought it wet, in buckets.
This is your brewer's yeast, and what this is it's the froth off the top of the beer. So as the beer is fermenting, that froth is scooped off.
Using beer, completely new to me. I'm used to taking it out of a packet.
Brewing and baking have always been closely linked trades because both rely on grains fermenting. Victorians preferred brewer's yeast to the ancient technique of sourdough because it was readily available, and to them, it tasted much better.
So the first thing you need to do is just scrape the froth off the top. So what you don't want to do is to get too much liquid in there.
Yeah.
The Victorian baker had to separate the yeasty froth from the dregs of beer because while their customers may have drunk it, they didn't want their bread to taste of booze.
This hasn't been done for 150 years.
This is what my ancestors would have been doing. It's kind of weird, that.
Then the dregs of beer must be carefully drained off because there's more yeast which has settled on the bottom.
Steady.
It strikes me as incredibly delicate.
Yeah.
Presumably there's nothing like this in...
Nothing. No. Modern day world, you're caught up in deadlines. When do people need it by? How much can you make by that time? Because that's where the profits are.
For a rural Victorian baker, time was less of an issue because customer demand was very steady and labour was cheap. Buying fresh yeast from the brewer, by contrast, was one of their biggest costs.
For us, it's an affordable product today. You buy it, you get on with it. Whereas here, it's like every single last bit that we could get out really mattered.
This is gold. And one tiny drop on the floor is money wasted. And if they drop the whole lot, you know, where do they go from there?
Right. And we're ready to go again.
Not only was brewer's yeast pricier, it was also weaker than the industrially produced strains used today. So the Victorian baker would mix it with a little flour to create something called the sponge, which would then be left for at least 6 hours.
Historically, baking had always been linked to other ancient trades, not just brewing, but also farming and milling. The traditional closeness of those industries is clear to see at Sacrowell, where the bakehouse was built as an extension to the older watermill.
The mill house and the bakehouse were owned by the same person in the Victorian period, and it may well have been that they shared the same labour force as well, all living here on site in this range of buildings.
The bakers and millers would also have been on first-name terms with the local farmer.
It would be his grain that would be brought into this mill house. It would be fed down these chutes, passed through these stones, or it would be ground into fine flour.
British bakers today rely on flour imported from across the world. The Victorians used fewer food miles. For our bakehouse, we've not only sourced English flour, but varieties of wheat which would have been grown in the 19th century. And that will make a huge difference to the bread the bakers create.
Back then, there were hundreds and hundreds of varieties of wheat. Every region would have grown a different blend of wheat strains, and every region's bread would have tasted differently as a result.
Very few of those types are still grown today. Farmers now rely on just a tiny number of scientifically crossbred strains. But archaeologist turned farmer John Letts grows heritage varieties, which is what we're using.
I do believe that many of the older wheats, certainly the older species like rivet wheat or spelt or emmer and the ancient grains, but a lot of these bread wheats, they do have differences in flavour. In many ways, bread today, the flavour, it comes from the butter and the jam that you put on it rather than the bread itself.
So what you are effectively saying is that bread's made from something like this, the bread itself would have flavour, or hopefully
that's how I see it.
And taste isn't the only quality that was different about Victorian wheat.
Modern wheat has been bred for higher gluten content. Gluten being the protein, obviously, that traps the air bubbles that makes bread rise. Whereas these older heritage wheats, Victorian wheats, the overall gluten content is lower.
So our modern breads made with modern flour, we would expect to be much higher, much more, I suppose, spongy and fluffier than a bread made with something like this.
Absolutely.
Back at Sacrowell, it's time for the bakers to turn their heritage flour into Victorian dough.
These are slightly more cumbersome than the ones we're used to.
It's a good look.
I can hold it up.
Does that go on like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's it like?
Lovely creamy colour. Plenty of bran in there still.
So we need 3 ounces of salt.
I wonder if the amount of salt meets the Department of Health guidelines these days.
What, today? I'd be very surprised by that.
Not a chance.
These ingredients will be added to the earlier brewer's yeast sponge mix, which has been left for 6 hours to ferment and, with any luck, expand.
Big reveal.
Oh, wow.
That's bubbled up really nicely, hasn't it? Well done, guys.
I mean, that's got to be 3 times the size.
Easily.
Check.
A
It's like a
happy
living
starter
thing.
is,
It is a
This
living
is
thing.
amazing. It's literally like...
So we'll get mixing, guys.
Should we do this as 2 two-man teams?
One two-man team and
Two
one
two-person
man,
teams,
one man and
excuse
a
me.
woman team.
In the 21st century, Harpreet bakes couture cakes, something there wasn't much call for in the Victorian countryside.
I think the beauty of being in the baking industry is that it's so wide, and you will have some people that literally only work with bread. And I wish I had that skill a bit more. But I think that I'm very able to just get stuck in and get on with it. Shall we get
Let's
stuck
go
in?
for it.
I'm actually finally getting to do something. We're not swapping for a while. This is definitely a good cardio workout, I
Yeah.
must say. How many of you in your kitchens would do this manually?
Generally speaking, this hard, labour-intensive process, which you're all sweating about, is done by a wonderful machine. This flour
Yeah.
is traditional English flour, yeah?
Yeah.
So I've been led to believe that it's not overly great.
Not compared to sort of
Today's standards.
today's standards, but this is ancient grains, remember. So, if we're not used to seeing these types of strains of wheat, it may be...
That actually wasn't
It
half
wasn't that bad, yeah.
Right, should we let them take over?
Mm-hmm.
It's really strong, isn't it? OK, I'm back again.
Look at that technique.
I'll tell you what, I'm adding water and salt content as I'm mixing here, guys, as the sweat's dripping in the dough.
Your forehead.
Yeah.
The dough finally comes together after half an hour's hard labour. Next, it needs to be left for another hour to prove.
What I love is that this is very close to the style of bread that I'm really, really passionate about. As longer fermentation as possible, because for me, bread making is all about flavour, flavour, flavour.
Former IT consultant Duncan Glendinning runs a small artisan bakery in Bath.
I make bread the way we've always made bread before machines and industry kind of came in.
So it's no surprise to find he's enjoying the unhurried, organic world of a traditional country bakery.
I'm seeing a lot of similarities with our style of baking, which is that we try and be very in tune with nature, working with the resources that are around. Good. That's time for a cup of tea.
Off we go.
Nothing stronger.
Rural Victorian bakers would have been serving a very specific type of customer. The rich wouldn't usually buy from tradesmen, they'd have relied on their own kitchen staff. And the middle class at this time was relatively tiny and mostly found in towns. So the bakers' customers were mainly working people who made up the vast majority of Britain's 27 million strong population.
This is representative of the working class diet at the beginning of the 19th century. Breakfast, for example, You've got bread, and butter. And then for your dinner, the main meal of the day for most of the working classes, you've got bread, potatoes, which sometimes replace some of the bread. And then if you're really, really lucky, you also have some meat. And then your last meal of the day, the one just before you go to bed, supper, bread, and perhaps a bit of cheese. If you were a rural worker in the 1830s and 40s, you would need to consume around 6,500 calories a day, so more than double the recommended government allowance of calories per person today. Most of that came in the form of bread.
It's not surprising to learn that the average Victorian family of 6 people got through a massive 55 pounds of bread per week.
That's the equivalent of 31 modern supermarket loaves. All of this in 1 week. And with bread so important to people's lives, bakers were also important.
They were one of the crucial building blocks of the British economy, one of the essential trades. There were around 44,000 bakers in Britain when Victoria came to the throne, twice as many as the industry employs today, even though the British population was half the size. Yet despite all this demand for bread, the typical baker's product range was rather limited.
Today, the average British household consumes over 100 different types of bread product, whether it's ciabatta or baguette or soft white bap. But back in the Victorian times, a rural bakery would really only have been turning out 2 different types of bread, household and wheaten.
These 2 varieties were enshrined in law. So important was bread that the government regulated its quality, weight, and even, for many centuries, the price a standard loaf could be sold for.
Household was your basic bread. Wheaten was slightly better. It was more finely ground and it cost up to 1/3 more per loaf. But they were both essentially white, or at least white-ish bread.
By the Victorian era, even the poorest demanded white bread, something which in earlier centuries had been the exclusive preserve of the rich. They paid more for it than they would have done for wholemeal, but it was felt to be higher status, as well as easier to digest.
Right, let's get this dough out of the trough now.
It's the more basic household dough these bakers have made, which they're now scaling up to make individual loaves.
Let's get as much of this out as possible. This is profit.
They're baking one of the standard weights of the time, the 2-pound loaf, equivalent to a modern large sliced. Tins weren't in widespread use by bakers at this point, so all loaves must be hand-moulded.
We're producing a traditional cottage loaf, loved by the people.
Another one?
Yeah.
Can do.
Go for it as it comes,
Another?
yeah.
This 2-tiered shape was by far the most familiar loaf for Victorians.
Let's get as many as we can going.
It only really fell out of favour in the later 20th century when demand for sliced bread increased.
Right, am I pushing these through?
Yeah, get them through, get them in straight away.
They followed their Victorian recipes, but they're using brewer's yeast for the first time. And the resulting dough isn't behaving as they'd want.
It's very wet.
This is totally losing its shape.
Yeah, we're losing the top into the bottom.
So these guys need to hit the oven now, because we're losing their shape.
Now they're sticking together. This is such a wet dough.
With their cottage loaves rapidly turning into pancakes,
Right, go.
it's a race against time to get them in the oven.
Oh, there you go.
They'll bake until risen.
Right, do your thing.
That's if they rise at all.
It could be that they're a complete disaster and we're going to have to chip it out.
I think let's wait and see how those turn out, and then
Yeah.
we know what to do a bit differently with these and with our next bake.
Bursting berry.
All of their labours so far have just got a baker's dozen into the oven. It's much smaller than they're used to.
It's like a campfire.
Yeah.
It's very strange.
I suppose what you've got here is really something on the threshold of domestic and commercial. So it's slightly bigger than you'd get in a domestic household, but totally recognisable to somebody who was just baking at home. I suspect it's the kind of thing that your family probably started in.
Yeah. Which is why it's interesting, you know, to have a go and look at it. But I'm in awe of why they used it.
The other thing about a bakehouse like this is that the oven isn't just there for your bread, but a lot of the villagers, the local community, would be bringing their bits and pieces to be baked as well. They wouldn't necessarily have ovens in their own houses, and you would charge people to come and bake things in your oven.
So they've got to really have a system in place where you're always constantly getting ready for the next batch, so it's constantly, you know, in work.
After an hour, the bakers find out what the oven's done to their worryingly wet household bread.
Is this one done? It's a bit soggy inside.
The fermentation from the dough has worked. It's brought out all the colours you want. It looks a nice loaf considering what we're working with.
It looks good, but the proof of the pudding's always in the eating.
Yeah.
But that's true.
Let's crack into this one.
Rather good.
That is nice. That's really nice loaf.
So much better than I expected. I expected it to be utter, inedible rubbish, to be fair.
It's like heaven.
It's like heaven.
Yeah.
To the untrained palate, I would say it's almost a bit like French bread, that crust. Is that sacrilege?
Well,
Not at all.
the French make fantastic bread, so the
beautiful.
Germans... You know,
But just that crust there.
but that's similar to a sourdough crust in a sense. It hasn't got the, you know, the richness and flavours that come through, but the actual depth of the crust.
You can see it's this beautiful kind of creamy colour.
It's quite open as well. I thought it'd be more dense.
The taste is what surprised me because it tastes beautiful.
The yeast has done its job. The one thing I'm amazed about is the brewer's yeast and how active it is. I mean, you know, that's...
It has actually done really well.
Oh, gosh, that is lovely.
This, for me, is what this has all been about, this. It's actually tasting history.
Yeah.
And I think this is as close as anyone will ever have got to an authentic bread from the late 1830s.
It would take at least 9 hours from first setting the sponge to the loaves coming out of the oven. But the baker's day wouldn't be over yet. While some of them cleared up or prepared for the next day, other bakers would need to go out and sell what they'd made.
People might be wondering where the high street is, but in somewhere like this, the rural community was really dispersed.
Yeah, I mean, you would have had a whole army of agricultural labourers out there, but you'd have all the village trades, like the cobbler, the thatcher, you've got the hedger, the blacksmith, the wheelwright. There's all manner of people that would need daily bread.
Yeah, and the baker, of course, would have known all of them, many of them from childhood.
Some of these customers would have called at the bakehouse door to buy their loaves, but most had them delivered by the more junior bakers.
Because of my family history, I knew that the door-to-door sales was important. They've got to physically take their bread to their customers every day, wind, rain or shine.
Everybody's within walking distance. My customers now, well, my goodness me, we're selling product in China. And we deal with them electronically through the internet. Here it would be, well, I suppose they call in and tell you what they want, or you see them face to face. That's a big difference.
The average price of a £2 loaf in 1837 was 4p and a farthing, roughly a quarter of what an agricultural labourer earned per day.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Hello. How are you?
We've got cottage loaves.
Could I have a little try?
You can, sir.
Thank you very much.
The great advantage for a rural bakehouse like this is that there's no real competition. If people want to get bread from somewhere else, their only real choice is to bake it themselves. And in most working-class households, they're just too busy to do that.
Yeah, so bakers had a kind of captive market.
That's very nice. Very
Thank you
flavoursome.
very much. Thank
It's
you.
completely different to modern bread, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah.
Having no competition sounds almost like a dream, to be honest. You know, there's no other baker snapping at your heels.
A bit stodgy.
They're not stodgy, sir. It's just to fill you up.
It'd be nice with some jam.
I did feel walking with the bread on my back. It's like retreading history for myself and thinking, you know, this has been done before by one of me.
A big lesson I learned today is that back then the bakery was ingrained within the community. The grain was grown in the fields. We then turned that into some lovely bread using the yeast from the local brewery. And then another job for the baker is actually to go out into the community and effectively sell the products back.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers. Long day.
Cheers, guys.
I have a feeling that the bakery and the pub were the heartbeats of the village, and it was these two places which really kept the village united together.
If I could have this life and still make a living, I would choose so. That maybe gives me a decision to make when I get home. You know, I'm just going to sell the bakery and do something, you know, like the good life or something. I could do this. I could retire here.
The rural baker's working day would typically begin around 6 a.m.
So far, it's all feeling a little bit idyllic for them, isn't it?
But I think they're still in the novelty phase.
Their Victorian forebears would have grafted 7 days a week, pretty much every week of the year, with much of the day spent on tasks which aren't part of a modern baker's job description. The two Johns, for instance, need to get the oven back up to heat, and in the 1830s countryside, that meant using a tinderbox.
I did not think that I would spend so much time doing non-baking stuff. Do you know what somebody needs to invent? Matches.
I've got a mate called Swan, he might do it.
Where's that chuffing historian? You know where this is going, don't you?
What I don't think they've quite realised is that if they were Victorian bakers, this would have been constant, though. Stoking the fire, filling the ovens, looking after the ovens, churning out loaves of bread. It may look absolutely beautiful, but back then it would have been real drudgery.
Okay.
Harpreet is taking bran left over from the milling process to feed pigs. Rural bakers sometimes kept livestock to supplement their income, since there was only so much they could make from selling bread to their limited pool of local customers.
Here you go.
This experience makes you really understand how thrifty people were when they needed to be. The byproducts of what we are using, the waste, then is fed to our animals to fatten them up, to make them better for us to eventually eat later on. And it just makes you understand how wasteful we actually are in modern day bakeries and in our lives in general.
For the new day's baking, they need another sack of flour. Although the flour mill is handily close, moving a Victorian sack even a short distance was never easy, because the standard weight was 20 stone. Victorian bakers were supposedly capable of carrying these single-handedly.
Somebody needs to get underneath it.
The sack is 7 times heavier than modern health and safety legislation would allow.
Can we go higher?
You trip over that.
Oh.
Gosh. Right.
Okay, so
Which way are we going?
We need to go out the door. Shall I just direct you? Okay, I'll direct you. Mind your head.
Thank God you're here, Harpreet.
Mind your head. Come down a bit.
Just, we're just going to have to put this down, guys, because I've just done a hernia.
Drop it then.
John needs help. John, we need to put it down. John needs help.
I have just done something really awful.
Fortunately, John's strain passes when he puts the sack down.
I don't think anybody can do it these days. We're just not strong enough. It's really silly because, I mean, I'm just carrying it and just all of a sudden I've just got like a somewhat popped. So they were built of sterner stuff than I.
The fact of the matter is they did carry them.
Yeah.
They used to come off the horse and trap and they used to bring them in by themselves.
Wow.
One person picking this whole thing up.
They were literally all hunched up because their muscles would grow because they could pick it up, but they would then be deformed.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
The bakers will use this new sack of flour to slightly expand their product line.
Yesterday you prepared loaves for your general customers, so your standard second loaf. But not all the bread that was bought would have been the sort of rural working class bread. You will also have had slightly posher customers.
In a rural area, there wouldn't have been many of these, but there would have been a few, like the local doctor, magistrate or vicar and their families, who would have demanded the higher grade of bread, wheaten, made with first-class flour.
So today we're going to go for that slightly more upmarket customer. What you're going to be making with your first flour is this particular shaped loaf known as the Coburg. Now, the shape is very, very old. The name is one that comes about in the 19th century. Queen Victoria marries Albert of Saxe-Coburg, and you find a lot of recipes, particularly baking recipes, are linked to the royal family, so they're named after Albert, Victoria, the children as they start to come along. So this is your loaf that's got that bit of royal glamour.
Every batch of bread Victorian bakers made meant getting physical, and with this small oven, they might make 5 or 6 batches a day.
Without any doubt whatsoever, machine mixed dough is better than hand mixed dough. By hand, everybody just tires, you know, and I'm used to watching a machine do it, but not at the same time as having to be the machine. That's the hard bit. Yeah.
In John's modern factory, it would certainly be easier to set the oven temperature. Before bread can be baked in this oven, the remains of the faggots have to be raked out and the floor cleaned with a swabber, so the bread doesn't taste of ashes. But the longer you take to clean your oven, the more heat it loses.
Do you think the oven's as hot? Because it was a hot oven.
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit warmer, to be honest. I'm just going to cool it down a bit. Have we got a cup of water?
I wouldn't go crazy cooling that down.
No, I don't know. Yeah. That's about right.
That is definitely evaporating a lot slower than it did yesterday.
Is it? Do you think so?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know how it holds the heat, do we? No. It seems to hold the heat.
Hoping they've judged the temperature right, the bakers start scaling their loaves.
Right, let's have a look at this dough.
This recipe calls for another of the standard Victorian sizes, the quartern, which weighed 4 pounds.
We would expect that these customers are going to be paying a little bit more. They're probably going to be a little bit more picky, a little bit less grateful, shall we say. So perhaps we just got to step it up for today, I think. How many you got?
You got baker's dozen and 2.
Baker's dozen and 2, right. The Coburg, we cut it into 4, and those little pieces of the 4 will just, hopefully, will stand up like a crown, very regal, because it's obviously a royal Coburg. Just using a bit of guess and a little bit of experience. That looks OK. I'm happy with that dough. I think that's a lot, to be honest.
OK, now let's hope for the best.
Despite her expertise being with cake, Harpreet is taking a central role in preparing the loaves. Though in the 21st century bread making is a profession dominated by men, it didn't used to be.
Women were a big part of the trade back in the 1840s. I mean, you've only got to look at John Swift's great-great-aunt to realise she started the bakery. She would have been doing most of the work. And we know from illustrations as well that women were very active in the baking business. This is one that shows a Cornish bakehouse, and you've got a man stoking the oven, but quite clearly you've got women kneading, rolling, scaling, measuring.
That's actually really funny because we do have one of the Johns that's very much in charge of the oven because he's worried I'm going to burn my eyelashes. And I have been looking after a lot of the weighing and the scaling and moulding, actually, so that does look like quite an accurate depiction of our bakehouse.
After an hour, the loaves intended for the bakery's posher customers come out of the oven.
Oh dear.
OK, so they don't exactly have the Coburg shape that we were after. Ooh.
You can't even call that bread, I don't think.
They're so pale.
Yeah.
I'm pushing this dough in, and it's completely still soft.
No.
Imagine how expensive that would have been. You wouldn't be able to get away with the amount of wastage that we have here. Definitely not.
So let's look at why it happened.
It's clear that the protein in this wheat is not what we're used to using.
So maybe we're missing something in the technique. Maybe they could work with this flour better because they were working with this flour better. It's been lost over 150 years, and with trial and error, we'll find it again.
I mean, another thing would be, it would be nice to have a thermometer for the oven. If there was any way we could have some idea of what the temperature is.
The oven just wasn't hot enough.
This is a great lesson to us about how little technology they actually had and how well they must have known their ovens.
I know one thing, my ancestors are now laughing at me.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, they're having a right
just
here.
Still totally...
I feel gutted. I don't like to see bread like that.
We've got this product that is unsaleable, so I would have thought that the consequences to a bakehouse in that era would have been absolutely huge.
To ruin that high prestigious bread, I can't. I mean, I know what I'd do in my bakery, and you know, we're talking major flip out. So that would have been disastrous. You know, possibly even, you know, end of.
The loaf intended for the wealthier rural customer has been a failure. But the Victorian baker would have been closer to the poorer end of the social scale, as with the bulk of their customers. Even in this apparently picturesque setting, poverty would never have been far away.
I think we've rather over-romanticised our pre-industrial past. We think of it, especially in terms of the countryside, as some pastoral idyll, roses round the door and everyone growing their own vegetables. But it wasn't like that at all. In many parts of the countryside, people really struggled.
To some extent, it was a problem caused by progress. Newly invented machines were putting agricultural labourers out of work, leaving them unable to afford their daily bread.
So what they did is they took to protesting, violent protesting, and they smashed many of these machines, and their chant was very simple: bread or blood.
In the 1840s, 3 years of bad harvest sent the price of wheat soaring. The impact this had on the price of bread was catastrophic.
A loaf like this would have cost you about 50% more than it would have done just 5 years before. Believe it or not, in parts of the British countryside, people were suffering from quite severe famine.
Even in good times, the average labourer might spend half to 2/3 of their income on food. Now some people spent all of their money on it, even the rent. Bakers were spared the worst deprivation because there was always demand for their services. But when wheat prices were high, customers could sometimes only afford a cheaper alternative made from different grains. Barley flour cost half the price of wheat flour.
To make barley bread by Sir John Coke.
Along with rye, barley was once commonly used in British baking, but by the 19th century it was only eaten by the very poorest.
This barley bread is eaten by many of the farmers in Devonshire and Cornwall, by most of the labourers in husbandry, and by almost all of the miners during the season of scarcity.
This is going to be a very, very dense, very heavy bread.
Like all flours except wheat, barley is low in gluten, which means it won't produce the light, fluffy texture which most British customers preferred then, as now.
This is stodgy. This is definitely designed to fill you up.
This is about subsistence.
In the 21st century, bakers mix barley, or rye, or spelt, with a little wheat flour to give it some rise. The resulting breads, far from being marketed to the poor and desperate, are these days premium products.
Nowadays, we're starting to see a huge following for the really heavier German rice sourdough breads and wholemeal breads. People love the brand, people love the seeds, because that's where the goodness is.
Generally speaking, the higher the class of place that you're supplying, the more bits there are. The more oaty, the more granular, and the larger the particle size, and so on and so forth. So, absolute opposite to what it was back then. Here goes, guys.
God, that would feed a family, wouldn't it? We all having a taste?
Top.
It's not bad.
It's okay.
No.
You can taste the barley, can't you?
It's got that kind of wholesome smell and wholesome taste to it.
Do you know what? If I had these in my shop, they would...
They probably would sell, wouldn't
go
they?
like that, wouldn't
They
they?
would go, actually.
Yeah.
But if you thought starvation or this, I'd take this.
Yeah, I'd take this.
This would be fine.
Some people couldn't afford any bread. There are heart-rending accounts of people living on crusts and raw onions, of parents depriving themselves so that their children could eat, and of people dropping to the ground at work, faint with hunger. People are becoming so poor and so desperate they can't even afford any form of bread. barley bread, whatever it is. And we know from various anecdotal evidence that people turn to a thing called crammings. Crammings are chicken feed. There's an agricultural practice with chicken farming where you literally cram your chicken, so you're cramming it down its throat, a bit like foie gras today, where you...
Force feeding.
Yeah, and this is because chickens are really expensive at this point. They're not the kind of...
So they're not for human consumption?
No, but we know people were eating them. So I suppose what I'd like us to try and work out is if you're so reduced in circumstances that you are eating chicken feed, how do you render it edible? They seem to be based predominantly on bran, water, lard. There are lots of vague recipes for them. So I would just have an experiment, really.
There would have been very little technique and effort put into this because this wasn't originally destined to feed human beings.
If they're that hungry, they'll just make them with whatever they've got to hand.
Exactly.
Knowing that I'm making chicken feed is not making me ecstatically happy about this.
I mean, this is just making my tummy groan.
But you got to think, bakers at this point are doing this to feed people.
Here we go, so we got shaping them.
Famished country folk bought crammings in penny bags. Bakers, with their constant supply of bran, were well placed to make and sell them.
How bad had it got? The mindset of people to want to eat chicken food. And that's quite sad, really, that would happen to this country, but also, you know, to my family, you know.
It was about sustaining yourself. It was about staying alive for these people. It smells like animal food.
There's no joy in making this, and there's no joy in eating this either.
Yeah. How unbelievably hungry
Desperate.
were these people?
Yeah.
I mean, this is just something to fill your tummy so that you can go to sleep, basically, isn't it?
On the table is basically desperation.
Yeah, it really is. That's been interesting about today, is seeing that shift change from, you know, being able to use the amazing flour to symbol of kind of like their class and everything.
Status.
To then basically eating the scrapings off the floor pretty much. Anything and everything
they could get their hands on.
It really is.
The harsh reality is people were dying, and this is what they had.
What they turned to.
Yeah, it's scary.
The hungry man has only one problem, and that is to get food. What would I do to feed my children if I were hungry? Well, perhaps just about anything.
Life in the countryside was becoming unsustainable.
It meant that people looked around to try and find a better life. And it was the rapidly industrialising centres of Britain that were sucking up the surplus labour from the countryside. Put simply, Britain was urbanising, and urbanising rapidly. But it meant for our rural bakers that their customer base was being eroded, that they had to diversify, that in some cases they had to close and move to the cities.
An ancient bond was breaking between the land where people lived and worked and the food that land produced. Country traditions which stretched back to the distant past were suddenly threatened with extinction. Our bakers, who will soon move to an urban setting themselves, are marking their final day in the countryside by celebrating one of the few rural rituals to survive. Harvest Festival took the form we know today in the early Victorian era.
In rural Britain of the 1840s, you would have very, very few days off. Okay, you could count Christmas, Easter, you might have a few days off after haymaking and harvest as the real times in which you'd have your holiday. And what we want you to do is to create something for effectively a harvest festival. And I think we want to bake something that's a real showpiece. Show off your skills and everything you've learned over the last few days to create a kind of celebratory loaf, a big wheat sheaf loaf. We've got an example here from the Victorian period. OK, it does say here, of course, the larger it is, the more hands it will be necessary to employ upon it.
The other thing we've got for you as well is this one really hopefully should appeal to Harpreet, is finally you get to cook a cake.
Yes!
Or at least it's what would have been called a cake in the 1840s.
Oh, okay.
So there's still no getting away from yeast, I'm afraid. What we want to do is to bake a caraway seed cake. Caraway seeds, immensely popular in Victorian England. They're quite cheap, but they're also very representative. They tend to be used as a symbol of life, of rebirth. So it's the kind of thing that would have been cooked probably once a year.
Anyway, let's get on, let's get that oven up to heat.
Let's get to work.
And let's have a day's baking.
Right, get in, boys.
Harvest festivals began to be celebrated in churches in the 1840s, but the celebrations had older, secular and pagan roots. To this day, harvest festivals remind us that the life-nourishing journey from field to food traditionally depended on the baker. For most people at this point in the 19th century, sugar was only used sparingly to sweeten tea, so even a plain seed cake would seem like a luxurious treat.
We've only been doing this for 3 days and we're already so excited by these fairly basic ingredients that we just take for granted as modern bakers. Caraway seeds is actually something that I've grown up with. So if you go to like an Indian restaurant or a curry house, towards the end of your meal, you would be provided with caraway seeds covered in a candy coating. So it's almost that combination of sugar and spice. It would be really interesting to see the impact that it has on the flavour of the cake.
This is rather like bakers that get to never grow up, because this is just Play-Doh, isn't it?
I have to admit, these are the biggest scissors I've ever seen.
Well, John, chop, chop.
Chop, chop.
Baking powder as we know it hadn't been invented in the 1840s, so the only way to get a light texture to your cake was to whisk. A lot.
So I am trying to get my egg whites into stiff white peaks using this. And this is a Victorian whisk that's been made out of birch twigs. And a Victorian baker would have actually created this themselves. And when you've got layer and layer of clothing on, it's just such hard work. Stiff peaks. I think I'm going to be here till tomorrow.
Let's just have a couple more ears.
Sea of wheat heads. Beautiful.
It's the first time Harpreet's ever made a cake with yeast, and the resulting mix is more like bread dough than cake batter.
There's no way that you would be making a cake like this in a modern bakery with no butter. It's just such a different consistency. I can't wait to get back to my bakery and think about incorporating caraway into what I make. Off we go.
Over their last lunch together, John decides to show his fellow workers the Victorian baker who started his business.
She is my great-great-aunt Harriet.
Wow.
And she's the one that started it all off while Tom was in the field.
And you can see the flour bag.
Yeah.
In the door.
More successfully in place. She probably was a bit stronger than me and you.
That's amazing.
Loaves in the thing.
Those loaves look fantastic compared to what we managed to make. Has your perception of what she would have done changed having come in here yourself?
Massively. You think in your head the Victorian time's this lovely time and it's great and everyone's happy and they all jolly around and eat goose and stuff, but, you know...
Not at this level of kind of society.
It's graft. It's really hard. Limited equipment, limited ingredients, and, you know, the heat. I mean, she's wearing pretty much what you are and, you know...
She doesn't look happy.
The caraway seed cakes have been in the oven for an hour. It's time to see if all that whisking has paid off.
That is not bad.
So they've got a good rise on them, haven't they? I mean, if you looked at the dough that you were putting in there, the batter that went into these tins was so stodgy. And then there's no baking powder in there at all, no bicarb. They've got a good rise to them because of the yeast.
That smell, everything that we've made so far is pretty bland, isn't it? And that's a real sensory overload.
It's the first sweet thing that we've been able to make because it was the first time we had access to sugar.
At last.
I know, finally!
Well done.
Woohoo!
Well done.
Look at this beautiful table.
All is safely gathered in.
We've invited some of the local community from Sacrowell to join us. In the Victorian countryside, all able-bodied men and women were expected to help with the harvest, and afterwards celebrated with a feast. Getting into the festive spirit, Annie and I have changed into the height of 1840s fashion, the kind of thing the local squire and his wife would have worn.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello. How's it going? Good evening.
There we go.
Oh, that looks fantastic.
Masterful. And the caraway cakes as well. An absolute triumph, Harpreet. And now for some dancing.
It's a chance for us all to reflect on our experience of the Victorian countryside.
I think, you know, as historians, we can sit in libraries all day and read history, but it's quite another thing to taste history.
One of the main things that I've found out has really been the central focus of the bakery in rural life and the extent to which what's happening in the economy would affect our lives so much.
We're partying like it's 1847. Never going to end, this beautiful rural little... But of course, you and I as historians know that this really is the end, actually, for rural Britain of this type.
Now, indeed, the sun is truly setting on a way of life which was hundreds of years old, and bakehouses like this would have served communities like this back into the medieval period and beyond. But by the time we get to 1830, you know, we really are looking at a Britain that is on the cusp of profound change.
They've got, what, 15, 20 years maximum before that swing happens and the majority of the population is now living in urban environments.
It's a time gone by, it's finished, it's over. I think this system of making bread is OK for that era in the countryside. When we're moving into the cities and the towns and industrialisation, there is no way you can keep up with it using the methods that we've used in this bakery here.
If our bakers were in the 1840s, it's going to be their children that we see move into a new world, a world which is much more urbanised, a world which is much more industrialised in some cases. I do fear that the next stage in our baking journey could be somewhat more challenging.
We've been very lucky so far, but we can see that actually things are happening in the country and the impact that that's having in the bakehouses. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned as to what was in store for us.
Next time.
Oh, that is actually disgusting.
Oh, well, it is, dear.
It's sort of borderline rancid.
The baker's experience, how the Industrial Revolution changed baking and Britain forever.
It's not bread as we know it.
What a thankless task.
You can't have people doing this.
At the moment, not only do I want to throw up, my back's hurting, my legs are hurting.
Then might I suggest it is time to stop?
Never.
Yeah,
The reason I came here was to see what my family did.
You want that
Well,
on your
thank you.
gravestone?